hold it up. I want to take a look at it.
Last time I got hit in the head. We had 57 killed and 140 wounded. And like my whole platoon was completely wiped out except for about 3 or 4 guys.
Yeah, for what? For what? Where's all the answers? Where's all the answers?
To see somebody come back who's 19 and you don't know what kind of future he's going to have, you know, you kind of wonder, is it all worth it?
See, the people in this country aren't fighting a Vietnam War. The government's fighting it.
Well, the government is the people, supposedly, but in this instance, it is not.
Anymore, it's not.
Love, love, love.
America was so confused. I mean, for the first time, you had fathers and sons fighting over what is patriotism. You had brothers and sisters fighting. What is patriotism? For the first time.
We all know we're faced with a very difficult problem in South Vietnam, which we're all familiar with, both from the military and the political side. Men have different views about what actions we should take.
American and South Vietnamese units will attack the headquarters for the entire communist military operation in South Vietnam.
Solution H2O, applied freely and under high pressure by the Rome Fire Brigade.
We are going to persist, and we are going to succeed.
Yet I believe that now, this generation of Americans is willing to pay any price to assure the survival and the success of liberty.
States Air Force on the 23rd day of May, December 66. Down at the bottom it says, this is an important record, safeguarded.
Is to make more clear than ever our own determination to undertake one last mission. To search out and destroy the last vestige of this barbaric war.
When you think of the Vietnam War, you probably imagine images of Americans fighting the Viet Cong. You probably think of the military draft, jungle warfare, and battling communism. In America, that's the extent of what you're taught. We know it was important, we know it was tragic, we know it was bloody. Yet it's a hazy memory, a ghost in history that's avoided. As Karl Marlantes, American author and Vietnam War veteran, put it, it's like living in a family with an alcoholic father. Yet it's no secret Americans are proud of our history of war. We celebrate the American Revolutionary War, which created the America we know today. We celebrate World War II, which defeated fascism. And we celebrate even the Civil War, which ended slavery in the South. We clearly don't shy away from violence. So what makes Vietnam different? The answer to that is complex. Suffice to say, this moment in time divided America, divisions that exposed the core of what it means to be an American, and how as Americans we should feel about our country. And when the war ended and the troops came home, no one quite knew how to process what happened. Thankfully, we had a medium to try and explain the unexplainable, to show a unique point of view, to express a provocative statement, to push back on what we had been told to think and how we should feel. A new subject for filmmakers was here, and in the years after the war, films were conceived by revolutionary filmmakers like George Lucas, Francis Ford Coppola, and Stanley Kubrick, and each had their own interpretation that changed how we viewed the war, changed how we viewed the war film as a genre, and changed our understanding of the power of cinema. America is no stranger to using movies as a propaganda tool. Hollywood in particular has been making war propaganda since the early 20th century, particularly during World War I, World War II, and the Cold War. The US government and military have even directly collaborated with filmmakers to shape public perception and justify military action.
Physical appearance counts for nothing. If he openly declares himself to be a communist, we take his word for it. If a person defends the activities of communist nations while consistently attacking the domestic and foreign policy of the United States, she may be a communist.
During World War I, silent films like The Kaiser, The Beast of Berlin, and To Hell with the Kaiser depicted Germany as evil and promoted American patriotism. During World War II, the War Department worked with studios to produce films that encouraged Americans to enlist, depicted the Axis powers, Germany, Japan, and Italy, as monstrous, justified U.S. military actions, and boosted morale on the home front. Further, films like Sergeant York and The Fighting Sullivan's painted soldiers as honorable war heroes to boost enlistment when America needed more soldiers. It's important to note that the United States used films to intensify anti-Japanese and anti-Asian racism to rally support for the war in the Pacific.
And Navy. The Army of Japan is a well-trained, sternly disciplined force of fanatics steeled to reckless courage by a primitive moral code.
While doing this, these films often failed to distinguish between different Asian ethnic groups, leading to discrimination against Chinese, Koreans, Filipinos, and other Asian communities. This helped lead to some broader stereotypes about Asians that carried to the Vietnam War. Stereotypes like all Asians look alike, Asians are loyal to Asians first, and Asians are either brutal or helpless, still exist to this day. A reason why this propaganda works so well is the American public trusted the government and institutions of power in a way that would be unthinkable today. But this all changed during the Vietnam War. American Vietnam veteran, counselor, and Veterans Affairs advocate John David Musgrave said, "We were probably the last kids of any generation that actually believed our government would never lie to us." During the Vietnam War, most mainstream films avoided criticism, aligning with the US government's propaganda and maintaining the status quo. The film The Green Berets was directly supported by the Pentagon and starred John Wayne as a heroic US soldier in Vietnam. The US Army had control over the screenplay and made several adjustments to align with their narrative.
No, sir, Mr. Beckworth. It doesn't take a lead weight to fall on me or a hit from one of those weapons. To recognize that what's involved here is communist domination of the world.
At the same time, Hollywood was focused on producing escapist films to keep American minds off the war and social turmoil. Musicals like The Sound of Music and Mary Poppins provided wholesome, family-oriented films. 2001: A Space Odyssey and Planet of the Apes offered a break from reality. Any filmmakers that attempted to make a film criticizing America's involvement in the war were turned away by Hollywood. However, even with all the escapist films and propaganda films, American opposition to the war began to rise in the mid-1960s, and public trust in the government began to decline. It reached its breaking point in 1968, and America descended into chaos. That year, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, leading to riots throughout the country. Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated as well. The 1968 Democratic Party convention in Chicago was disrupted by thousands of protesters. And in Vietnam, the Tet Offensive occurred, a major North Vietnamese attack on South Vietnam. More than 2,600 U.S. soldiers and 4,000 South Vietnamese soldiers died, and an estimated 50,000 North Vietnamese and Viet Cong soldiers died, and an estimated 12,500 civilians died. Going into the 1970s, public trust of the government hadn't recovered. According to Pew Research and historical Gallup polls, by 1974 public trust in the government reached 36%, and by 1980 it was at 25%. Famously, the Watergate scandal came to light, leading to President Nixon resigning after covering up his crimes. Then there was an economic crisis, then the Iran hostage crisis. President Reagan briefly improved trust in the 1980s, but it has never returned to pre-Vietnam levels. And because of all the turmoil, corruption, lies, violence, and distrust, American cinema radically changed, and it opened the door for films that were critical of the government, the military, and war, particularly the Vietnam War. For the first time in American history, Americans were hungry for stories that questioned government authority, exposed corruption, and showed war as horrific rather than honorable. However, it was going to take some time to ease these films into the mainstream. While it may not seem like it, at its conception and fundamentally, Star Wars from 1977 is a Vietnam War movie. In a 1973 note regarding his Star Wars project, director George Lucas described the story as a large technological empire going after a small group of freedom fighters. This is a clear reference to the dynamic of the Vietnam War, where the technologically and financially superior American military was fighting against a smaller, guerrilla-style Viet Cong force. With the Galactic Empire acting as a stand-in for the United States government and military, and the Rebel Alliance acting as a stand-in for the Viet Cong, there's really no ambiguity on who the heroes and the villains are in the story, and Lucas made virtually no attempt to hide it. The Galactic Empire was designed to look industrial, monolithic, and oppressive. Their colors are blacks, whites, and grays, creating a feeling of order and cold lifelessness, exemplified by the glossy black of Darth Vader's armor. Officers in the Empire wore clean, military-style uniforms, inspired by Nazi and Soviet uniforms. Stormtroopers' armor is faceless, lifeless, more machine than men. The inside of the Death Star has geometric lines, perfectly shined metal, and very harsh lighting. It's brutalist, dystopian. The hallways are large and empty, creating a sense of pointlessness for individuals within the machine. On the other hand, the rebels have a rugged and diverse aesthetic. Their colors include browns and greens, grounding them in nature. Rebel pilots wear orange flight suits, easily distinguishing them from the Empire fighters. X-Wing and Y-Wings are worn out and patched up. Characters wear clothing loosely fit, and various outfits emphasize the individuality of each rebel, like Han Solo's vest and Leia's robes. The Empire was also shot, usually using low angles to create an imposing presence. Characters like Darth Vader and Grand Moff Tarkin are often framed in symmetrical compositions, emphasizing control and uniformity. High contrast lighting is used in Imperial scenes. Shadows were stark and sinister. The rebels were shot with more movement and action and urgency, sometimes with a handheld camera. Rebel bases have softer, natural lighting, showing their connection to life. And of course, Luke is the protagonist and hero of the story, joining the rebels to fight against the Empire. For some context, much like the Empire, by the time of the Vietnam War, the US was a global superpower. The Empire controlled the galaxy and the US controlled the Western world. And the US was looking to expand its influence further through imperialism. Due to the principles of the US being built around capitalism, naturally the greatest threat to the US at the time was the Communist Soviet Union. Communism was spreading throughout Asia, with China becoming a communist country in 1949 after the revolution, North Korea solidifying communist control, and various Southeast Asian communist movements in effect. In Vietnam, the Viet Minh, led by Ho Chi Minh, fought French colonial rule, culminating in the First Indochina War. Vietnam was then divided into Communist North Vietnam and Anti-Communist South Vietnam. The US saw Vietnam as a key battleground in stopping communist expansion, and the US was willing to do whatever it took to keep communism contained, no matter how brutal the methods. The Empire in Star Wars displayed a similar level of brutality when it came to stomping out the rebels, with the Death Star, a massive battle station capable of destroying planets with a laser, as a metaphor for the American military. Just as the US used advanced weaponry like napalm in Vietnam and Cambodia to kill hundreds of thousands of people, the Death Star represents a belief in technological supremacy and a willingness to harm civilians to achieve victory. Given Lucas was originally intended to direct the film Apocalypse Now, which is a film explicitly about the Vietnam War, but no studio would fund a Vietnam War movie at the time, he instead channeled his frustration with the war, government corruption, and authoritarianism into a sci-fi allegory. Knowing how hesitant studios were to fund politically charged projects, Lucas kept this allegory to himself and pitched his movie as apolitical. Upon Star Wars' release in 1977, America was still deeply divided, with the war only ending 2 years prior. Americans were either traumatized by the conflict or angry over how it had been handled. If Lucas were to have revealed his key inspiration for the film, the controversy would have been seismic, dramatically jeopardizing the film's success.
The story of a boy, a girl, and a universe. It's an epic of heroes.
By promoting the film as an apolitical space opera, Lucas was able to maintain a broad audience appeal, and it worked.
The movie is called Star Wars, and since it opened here 9 days ago, capacity crowds have filled the 1,100 seats in the theater almost daily.
Star Wars ended up earning around $221 million in domestic box office revenue, making it the highest grossing film of that year. By 1980, it had grossed a total of $510 million worldwide. And as the original trilogy turned into one of the most valuable entertainment franchises in the world, financially it was better to keep it as aesthetically apolitical as possible. It wasn't until years later after the film's release did Lucas begin discussing the parallels between Star Wars, Vietnam, and rebellions in general. In an AMC Talk conversation with director James Cameron, he remarked about the American Revolution and the Vietnam War.
You know, we're fighting the largest empire in the world.
Right.
And we're just a bunch of hayseeds in coonskin hats who don't know nothing.
That's right.
And it was the same thing with the Vietnamese.
Lucas also revealed his primary inspiration for the main antagonist, Emperor Palpatine, to be Richard Nixon, former President of the United States. Nixon, who served from 1969 to 1974, was seen by many as a deceitful tyrant due to the Watergate scandal and his involvement in the Vietnam War. In the 2013 book by J.W. Rinsler, The Making of Return of the Jedi, Lucas is quoted in an interview from 1981. He was asked whether Palpatine was a Jedi. He replied, "No. He was a politician. Richard M. Nixon was his name. He subverted the Senate and finally took over and became an imperial guy. And he was really evil, but he pretended to be a nice guy." In the end, Lucas wasn't able to direct his project, Apocalypse Now. He realized Hollywood and Americans weren't ready to face the Vietnam War on screen head-on, so he created an allegory instead. However, just a couple years later, a close friend of Lucas got his hands on the failed project and decided he was going to make the film, come hell or high water. His name is Francis Ford Coppola.
My film is not a movie. My film is not about Vietnam. It is Vietnam. It's what it was really like. It was crazy. And little by little we went insane.
Coppola being the inspiration behind Star Wars iconic smuggler Han Solo should tell you a lot about who Coppola was and still is today. He's been described as daring, unorthodox, crazy. In 1968, Francis founded American Zoetrope, a company dedicated to filmmaking outside the Hollywood system. One of their first projects was Apocalypse Now, a Vietnam War story based loosely on the 1899 novella Heart of Darkness by Polish-British novelist Joseph Conrad. The film concerns Captain Willard's mission to assassinate a Green Beret colonel named Kurtz. Kurtz had gone insane and is conducting the war on his own terms deep in Cambodia.
Terminate the colonel. Terminate with extreme prejudice.
At the time of the script's writing, the war was raging on. People were getting married and moving to Canada to avoid fighting. The original plan was to film in Vietnam, in 16mm, but that fell through considering the risk of death was so high. Point Blank Studios would not finance a film about the Vietnam War, so the film was shelved. When Zoetrope was revitalized in 1975, Apocalypse Now was the first project, and it had to be fully independent. The original budget was $13 million. Francis had to raise the money himself, and he's responsible if it goes over budget. He even put up his own assets as collateral, something very few filmmakers would dare to do.
Must have been a couple of $1 million of Francis's money was in it, but that was Francis's style. His philosophy was always, I think remains to this date, is I'm going to go and make the movie, and if everybody knows I'm going to make it, it will fall into place.
The Philippines was chosen as the shooting location because of its similarity in territory to Vietnam. As expected, the U.S. Army refused to cooperate. This would not be a puff piece for the military. Francis made a deal with the Philippines president, Ferdinand Marcos. Coppola was to pay thousands of dollars per day to the military to use their helicopters, and the helicopters would leave sometimes during shooting randomly to go fight in the country's civil war.
The Filipino commanders were afraid there could be an attack on the helicopters we were using. In the middle of a complicated shot, the helicopters were called away to fight the rebels.
Coppola said, "My desire is that it sheds some light on the events that took place and why they took place and what it did to the people involved in them. Coppola didn't want to use an allegory. He wanted to confront the war head-on, diving deep into the psyche of Americans fighting in Vietnam. In Willard's opening scene, he's alone in a Saigon hotel room, covered in sweat, drinking and having a breakdown. The scene overlays helicopter blades with a ceiling fan in the hotel room. Willard can't distinguish between the war and everyday life anymore. He's trapped in violence. The room is covered in yellow and orange hues. It's suffocating and sickly. Shadows partially cover Willard's face. He's fractured and constantly in conflict. The camera is slow and drifting like a dream. Later, the camera shifts to a handheld, chaotic perspective when Willard breaks down completely, crying, smearing his face with blood after cutting his hand open. After the war, many soldiers dealt with similar situations, particularly in terms of PTSD, substance abuse, and the challenges of returning to civilian life. A 2020 study from Columbia University Mailman School of Public Health found that 9% of Vietnam veterans continued to suffer from PTSD, with the rate increasing to 15.5% among those exposed to heavy combat. Soldiers experience flashbacks, constant hypervigilance, and emotional detachment.
I don't know what I see, but I'll just say this, that it immediately transports me back to Vietnam, and I relive what happened over there.
Many soldiers became alcoholics and drug addicts. Some became addicts in Vietnam. Heroin use was particularly common. For soldiers, Vietnam became their home, and they felt alienated when they came back to America, where they were villainized by their peers. They developed depression, anxiety, and suicidal thoughts. Vietnam veteran John Musgrave nearly took his own life. In Apocalypse Now, Willard states, "When I was here, I wanted to be there. When I was there, all I could think about was getting back into the jungle." Over time, soldiers became almost addicted to combat, unable to adjust to normal life because war gave them a sense of purpose. For months, or even years for some soldiers, war and combat was everyday existence. They were taught to kill, and they killed soldiers and civilians, while constantly being under threat from the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese. Fighting in Vietnam was like being in a consistent adrenaline rush, and civilian life couldn't possibly replicate that. Coppola also wanted his movie to be a big show, big lights, music, like a fantasy world popped up in the jungle, as if American culture was transported into Vietnam. The idea came to life especially in the Playmate sequence. In the sequence, Captain Willard and his crew arrive at a remote U.S. military outpost, where a Playboy USA show is being staged for American soldiers. Playmates emerge from a helicopter and perform a dance in revealing outfits, exciting the crowd, exciting the troops. The soldiers rush the stage, and the event is cut short. The Playmates are evacuated by helicopter as the soldiers erupt in chaos. It's an absurd moment, highlighting the exploitation of both soldiers and women, and the escalating sense of madness as Willard's journey down the river continued to find Kurtz. In moments like this and others, the film was depicting a psychedelic war as well. The culture was seeping into the area, clashing with the native culture. Drugs were being used freely in Vietnam. Coppola wanted to reveal all of this. Vietnam became a lawless land where motivations, honor, and purpose were being questioned at every moment. The co-writer John Milius had many anecdotes from his friends who had been fighting over there, so he understood to an extent the psyche of these soldiers. Disillusionment among soldiers became common when they realized the propaganda of being there to help the Vietnamese was a lie. In fact, the South were openly hostile to them, seeing them as foreign invaders.
I really was disappointed that there weren't people standing along the road waving to me and offering me flowers and things. I really expected to be greeted with open arms as a liberator, and it was as though I was invisible.
In the fighting, mountains and hills were being fought for, and a day later they were abandoned. Soldiers were being instructed to burn local Vietnamese houses, with little to no evidence they were helping the Viet Cong. Coppola was on a quest to take a look at the insanity of the Vietnam War, as well as the sheer brutality of it, and crucially the cold indifference the American military had for the Vietnamese people. The boat massacre scene was directly inspired by the infamous My Lai massacre, conducted by American soldiers in the village of My Lai, where instead of engaging enemy combatants, they massacred between 347 and 504 unarmed Vietnamese civilians, including women, children, infants, and the elderly. In the boat massacre scene in the film, Willard and his crew gunned down innocent Vietnamese civilians. The scene shows how soldiers, caught in the chaos and paranoia of war, can lose their sense of humanity. The civilians in the boat pose no real threat, yet they are slaughtered out of fear and carelessness. The moment forces the audience to confront the reality of war crimes and the moral collapse that war breeds. After killing civilians, Chef takes their puppy, as if it somehow compensates for their actions. This dark irony highlights how the soldiers are desensitized to killing Vietnamese civilians and Vietnamese soldiers, but feel more compassion for something Americans appreciate. Given the Vietnam War was only a few decades after World War II, a period of time Americans were flooded with anti-Japanese propaganda that bled into racism against all Asians, the scene shows how the Vietnamese are treated as subhuman, whether it be civilians or combatants. By creating scenes like this, Coppola squashes any chance of the audience perceiving Willard and his crew of being heroes.
Some friendlies, Captain. She's wounded. She's not dead.
Yeah, Nisha.
The book says, Captain.
It's worth mentioning production on Apocalypse Now was a nightmare. The weather was incredibly unpredictable, typhoons occurred randomly, destroying entire sets. Francis still wanted to film in these conditions because Vietnam had similar weather and believed this could add more authenticity to his film. Coppola during production was still trying to figure out how to tell the story, as he was unhappy with the script. He couldn't figure out the ending. They were struggling financially, going well over budget, and this was getting put in the headlines as Coppola was putting together the money, leading to Coppola threatening to end his own life numerous times. The movie was changing Coppola through the years of production. Coppola couldn't go back, and he was changing like Willard. So the movie was changing too. Coppola also worked in a way that was unordinary to the point of recklessness, and maybe even unprofessional. He changed things constantly on the fly. Sometimes he didn't know what scenes or shots to use when arriving on set. The actors were losing their minds too.
And I really appreciate Francis Wright. Even though he does drop it on you sometimes.
Actors were using drugs constantly. Dennis Hopper admitted to using cocaine and marijuana on set. Martin Sheen was drinking heavily. Sam Bottoms was using LSD. Over time, things entered a dreamlike state, instead of making a film with the days blending together over the course of over a year of filmmaking. Native tribes were recruited to be Kurt's private army, and they performed their own rituals and sacrificed animals, and did dances with the actors and crew. Brando came in incredibly overweight, straining the production. Marlon didn't read the book, Heart of Darkness, or understand his character at all. The production process for Apocalypse Now was a disaster and traumatic for many involved. But the irony is it undeniably helped make the film raw and unhinged, adding a layer of authenticity that couldn't have existed if the production went smoothly as planned. Editing took over 2 years, and the film was finally released in August 1979, more than 3 years after filming started. When Apocalypse Now premiered, it received a polarizing but powerful response from audiences.
But some of the folks coming out of theater had mixed reactions to what they saw.
It was just crummy. I've never seen such crummy movies in my life. I was in Vietnam for 9 months, and I never seen anything like that.
I'm chilled. I'm chilled by it. Extremely depressing and very unentertaining.
Some were shocked by its intensity, comparing it to a hallucinatory nightmare of war, and some were confused by its abstract ending. Regardless, the film became a massive hit, grossing over $150 million worldwide. Critics praised its ambition, visuals, and sound design, a cinematic experience unlike any other war film at the time. Famed film critic Roger Ebert called it one of the greatest films ever made. However, many critics felt it lacked a clear message. Outside of critics, the people dealing with disillusionment of post-Vietnam America appreciated the dark, surreal take on the Vietnam War. But Vietnam War veterans had mixed opinions.
I don't believe Coppola has been to Vietnam, and the movie certainly was not full of truth about what went on in that war.
Common complaint was that the film focused too much on the psychological horrors of war instead of combat tactics and the heroics of soldiers. Some were upset that the public would now view veterans as being lunatics. However, soldiers that fought could relate to the chaotic, surreal tone, saying Vietnam felt just as confusing and unpredictable as the movie portrayed. As expected, the US government and military were not happy. The entire film clashed with the military's official narrative of the war. The film could potentially be fuel for the growing anti-war sentiment. Before Apocalypse Now, most Americans already saw Vietnam as a tragic failure, but were removed from the actual violence. Now they were forced to confront the horrors of war, and it cemented Vietnam's image as chaotic, brutal, and insane, rather than altruistic, and it stripped away any lingering illusions of glory in Vietnam. It reinforced the idea that America didn't just lose the war militarily, but also, and maybe more importantly, morally. The very idea of American exceptionalism was being chipped away. The movie aligned with the feelings of the 1970s Vietnam syndrome, a national reluctance to engage in future wars due to the devastating failures of Vietnam. Apocalypse Now didn't tell Americans what to think about Vietnam. It made them feel it through art in a way that only movies can do. After this film, there was a noticeable shift in the war genre towards psychological trauma and moral ambiguity. And less than a decade later, another iconic director chose to tackle similar themes with their own take on Vietnam. Stanley Kubrick had a long-standing interest in war films already. Kubrick had explored war in the anti-war film Paths of Glory and the black comedy film Dr. Strangelove, but he wanted to make a Vietnam War film that stood apart from traditional war movies and from prior Vietnam War films like Apocalypse Now. Instead of making a fever dream, Kubrick wanted to make the Vietnam War appear clinical, cold, and detached, matching his trademark style. In the early 1980s, Kubrick read a New York Times review of Gustav Hasford's 1979 novel The Short Timers, a semi-autobiographical account of Hasford's experience as a U.S. Marine in the Vietnam War. Kubrick was impressed by its brutal realism, dark humor, and unique portrayal of war, especially its focus on boot camp and the dehumanization of soldiers, a stark difference from Apocalypse Now. Kubrick said in an August 27, 1987 issue of Rolling Stone, "It's a very short, very beautiful, and economically written book, which, like the film, leaves out all the mandatory scenes of character development, the scene where the guy talks about his father, who's an alcoholic, his girlfriend, and all that stuff that bogs down and seems so arbitrarily inserted into every war story." The script went through several rewrites, with Kubrick removing some of the surreal elements from Hasford's novel and emphasizing realism. To make the movie feel more observational, Kubrick wanted to remove as much emotion from the story as possible. Kubrick was also able to secure studio funding. It was backed by Warner Bros. From the start. By the mid-1980s, attitude toward Vietnam War films had changed. Several commercially successful and critically acclaimed movies about the war had been released, such as The Deer Hunter, Apocalypse Now, and Platoon. There was an undeniable appetite for films that questioned and critiqued American military actions during Vietnam, and studios were especially open to a director as reliable as Kubrick to tackle these controversial issues. Kubrick had a long-standing relationship with Warner Bros., dating back to A Clockwork Orange and The Shining. The studio trusted his vision and gave him significant creative control, so Warner Bros. Financed and distributed the film. Kubrick worked at his own pace and shot the film over 2 years, and the studio provided a $17 million budget, which was relatively modest for a war film. The US government also wasn't willing to provide any assistance for the film. However, by the time Full Metal Jacket was released in 1987, the Vietnam War had been over for more than a decade. The US government was no longer as sensitive about Vietnam War films as it had been in years prior, so they didn't actively oppose the film. Kubrick divided the film into 2 parts. Part 1, Boot Camp, focusing on the psychological breakdown of recruits under the brutal gunnery Sergeant Hartman, played by R. Lee Ermey, and Part 2, War in Vietnam, showing the dehumanization of soldiers as they navigate urban combat. The first part of Full Metal Jacket takes place at Marine Corps Recruit Depot Paris Island, where a group of young recruits undergo brutal treatment under gunnery Sergeant Hartman. The recruits arrive at boot camp and are immediately subject to Hartman's verbal and physical abuse. He gives them nicknames, including Joker and Pile. Pile, an overweight and clumsy recruit, struggles with basic training and becomes the target of relentless bullying from both Hartman and eventually his fellow recruits. Joker is assigned to mentor Pile, and Pile improves when shown kindness rather than abuse. Pile eventually excels at shooting, but starts exhibiting disturbing behavior once Joker abandons him, including talking to his rifle. He becomes eerily disciplined, but is now completely void of emotion. On the night before graduation, Joker finds Pile in the bathroom loading his rifle. Pile, in the midst of a mental breakdown, shoots and kills Hartman before shooting himself. The boot camp sequence in Full Metal Jacket is regarded as one of the most realistic depictions of Marine Corps training for the Vietnam War. Boot camp for the Marine Corps was notoriously brutal, intense, and designed to break down recruits before rebuilding them into disciplined soldiers. It was one of the harshest military training programs in the US and aimed to prepare young men for the extreme conditions of jungle warfare in Vietnam. The goal was to create hardened soldiers who would kill without hesitation. Recruits were desensitized to violence through chanting cadences like, they were constantly reminded that their purpose was to eliminate the army without mercy, and racial slurs were used frequently to dehumanize the Vietnamese population. All of this was shown in the film, for both in reality and in the film, boot camp was designed to turn people into simply instruments of war, to be used to satisfy the desires of the American government. If people become weapons, they are now expendable, just like a gun or a knife. As said in an analyst by Bill Crone, the film shows the process of indoctrination, with little reference to combat training per se. say. To enhance realism even further, Kubrick cast R. Lee Ermey, a former Marine drill instructor, as Gunnery Sergeant Hartman. Ernie's first-hand experience allowed him to improvise a lot of his dialogue, bringing a level of authenticity that other actors couldn't.
One for the Commandant! One for the Corps!
The movie employed meticulous framing and a stark visual style to recreate the oppressive nature of boot camp. The camera rarely moved, reinforcing the feeling of discipline, structure, and control. Green, beige, and gray color the boot camp, giving it a soulless feeling. Drill sequences, punishments, and exercises follow a predictable pattern. The barracks are depicted with clean, orderly lines, emphasizing all suppression of individuality. The visuals reinforce the idea that these men are a cohesive unit. For part 2 of the film, Private Joker, now a war correspondent for Stars and Stripes, is stationed in Vietnam. Joker still resists the war's brutality. He wears a peace sign on his helmet, even though the helmet is emblazoned with the words, "Born to Kill." Upon entering combat zones, Joker finally comes face to face with the cruelty of his fellow soldiers. He witnesses a soldier gun down civilians with glee,
Get some, baby!
killing women and children indiscriminately, and including them in his kill count.
How can you shoot women, children? Easy! You just don't lead them so much!
Joker reunites with his old training friend, Cowboy, and joins his squad in the combat of the Tet Offensive in Hue City. The squad is eventually ambushed by a hidden Viet Cong sniper. The sniper kills multiple squad members, including Cowboy. When Joker finally finds the sniper, his weapon jams, forcing his fellow journalist to shoot the sniper. The sniper is revealed to be a young Vietnamese girl. Instead of fighting the Viet Cong men they've been taught to kill and treat like savages, their enemy ended up being a girl fighting alone in a decimated city. As the girl lies wounded, Joker hesitates but ultimately executes her. Joker is now fully transformed into the emotionless tool of war that boot camp molded him to be. Even though Kubrick wanted to make Full Metal Jacket as realistic as possible, he wasn't willing to shoot the film in Vietnam or in Southeast Asia like Coppola did. Kubrick is known for his meticulous and controlled filmmaking, choosing to shoot entirely in England rather than face the unpredictability that Coppola went through. He transformed locations like the abandoned Beckton Gas Works in London to replicate the battlefields of Vietnam. This allowed Kubrick greater control over the environment, which worked for Kubrick's observational approach. Kubrick's team painstakingly recreated Vietnamese street signs, storefronts, and architecture to match the war photography of Hue. Vietnamese civilians and extras were cast to add further realism. Kubrick used natural daylight and smoke effects to create the hazy, humid atmosphere typical of Vietnam. The yellowish and muted tones mimic the look of Vietnam as seen in war photographs and documentary footage. Many scenes, especially combat sequences, were filmed with handheld cameras to give an immersive, documentary-like feel similar to real Vietnam War footage. Practical explosions and controlled demolitions were used to mimic the destruction of war. Fire and smoke effects were employed to create a burning cityscape, as was seen in real footage from the Tet Offensive. Kubrick intentionally contrasted the boot camp's rigid order with the war's chaotic reality to show how military training dehumanizes soldiers, only for them to be thrust into a brutal war where their training is meaningless. When the movie was released in 1987, Full Metal Jacket received positive reviews and performed well at the box office. It grossed $120 million worldwide on a budget of $16 million. Critics praised the movie for its portrayal of war and the psychological transformation of soldiers. The film's first half was particularly praised for its intensity and realism. Audiences appreciated the film's dark humor and R. Lee Ermey's portrayal as Gunnery Sergeant Hartman. Over time, the movie has developed a cult following, with many considering it one of the most authentic war films of all time. Full Metal Jacket continued the trend of darker, more psychological Vietnam War films that followed Apocalypse Now and also Platoon. The financial success and cultural relevance of Full Metal Jacket signified pro-war propaganda films had largely fallen out of favor, particularly in relation to the Vietnam War. The cultural shift following the war, combined with the impact of earlier anti-war films like Apocalypse Now, The Deer Hunter, and Platoon, led to a greater focus on the psychological and moral consequences of war rather than glorifying it. By the late 1980s, Hollywood largely avoided direct pro-war narratives, especially concerning Vietnam, and instead focused on the personal experiences of soldiers and the complexities of war. Even successful pro-war propaganda movies like Top Gun were designed to be a recruitment tool, showcasing things like high-octane high-octane aerial combat and camaraderie rather than the brutal realities of war. By the late 1990s and 2000s, war films shifted toward focusing on individual soldiers rather than grand political statements. Films that come to mind are Saving Private Ryan, The Thin Red Line, and Hacksaw Ridge. Nowadays, that's the standard American war film. While public fury at the government and the military have dissipated over the years with the help of the Reagan presidency and events like 9/11, there was still no going back to the war films of pre-Vietnam. Patriotism and heroism in regards to the military exist prominently today, but not to the degree that the average American will believe war to be a purely glamorous endeavor. Americans now with the internet can even see footage of real war happening in almost real time. Of course, the American military propaganda machine will still continue to spin, and who knows how American sentiment will change in the coming years. Regardless of what happens, history has shown us cinema is going to have a role to play. Still, films alone are never going to help the public know the intricacies of the Vietnam War, or any other conflict America has involved itself in. Not when it benefits the government for people to remain ignorant. To understand what Americans did during the Vietnam War in particular is to acknowledge America's failures, cruelty, dishonesty, and immorality. It's an unpleasant truth, but it's reality. Ultimately, cinema and art as a whole can only do so much in helping us process the world. It's our responsibility to do the rest of the work.